It was a great reading, wasn't it, from the prophecy of Isaiah 53. And the prophecy, that particular prophecy there is obviously talking about the sufferings and the subsequent glory of the servant or Christ, as it's quite obvious from that reading that we can see that. And in relation tonight to our title, History Fulfills Bible Prophecy, there is so much evidence to show that the history of the world, as much as we have recorded, does fulfill and support Bible prophecy. And many critics of religion would attempt to discredit Scripture and its prophecies as a Jewish or a Christian conspiracy, possibly. Or at best, they might say it's a good story and a good history book. But the Bible definitely does have a solid track record of fulfilled prophecy, and it actually parallels with external recorded history that we can see in the world around us. And it's supported by an ample archaeological evidence. So the basis of this address is obviously the Bible, which you've read from tonight. And for a few moments, firstly, I'd just like to review what and how exactly it came to be, and why we should believe what it says in the first place. And I believe this to be paramount in regarding anything about the Bible. So, in regards to time, the Bible describes an absolute beginning only about 6,000 years ago. And we as Bible students expect to see no older existence of written history than that. And we expect the location of any artefacts that are dug up to be found in the ancient centre of the world, in the Middle East there. And according to conventional archaeology that you'd learn at school, we are told that writing itself, the art of writing, wasn't actually invented until 3000 to 4000 BC in Sumeria or Mesopotamia there, that Fertile Crescent. And from biblical records, that's just after the time described as the worldwide flood, when God destroys all the wicked human life, and Noah and his family are preserved and begin to repopulate the earth in that exact area of Mesopotamia, the Fertile Crescent, as it's called. So it's not really a surprise then that the oldest discovered evidence of writing are limestone tablets found in Iraq, which is ancient Mesopotamia. And historians date these to around 3500 BC, and they say that they're the oldest form of coherent writing ever discovered. And another conventional understanding among historians is that the second big civilization, so the Mesopotamians or the Sumerians were the first, and it's common knowledge that the second oldest civilization to date is the Egyptians, which historians say could be as old as about 3000 BC, possibly a little bit younger than that. And when we follow the biblical timeline, the next civilization we come to in Genesis is, of course, the Egyptians. And it's no surprise, and straight away we can sort of see, even just from a basic look like that the Bible record does actually parallel with common ancient history, like it's taught in school. Right back to the very earliest physical evidence that man can find in the world today. So in general, the fact that the Bible follows that time record is not really disputed among historians. And the Bible itself, as we have it here, has quite the history in itself. 2,500 years from the beginning of time described in the Bible, God inspires a man called Moses to physically record the first 5 books of the Bible. And over the next 1,500 years, God inspires 40 different men among 3 different continents and many different languages to continue cataloguing and compiling the history of his people and what happened to them. Until in the early century, as we call it, AD, 2,000 years ago, they were recorded, passed down, copied, and very much protected for 1,500 years. So straight off, it was such an immense task, I believe, for one nation, a small nation like Israel, amongst a very hostile world, to preserve such a large collection of books completely. And by this stage in time, in AD, much more general history is being recorded. And we today have many facts about the past 2,000 years. So much of it can be confirmed and substantiated. The early centuries in the Common Era are known as the Christian era. And not surprisingly, following on from the massive impact that Jesus Christ had on the world. Christianity was under persecution in those early centuries, especially by the ruling power, Rome at the time. One of the early emperors ordered, at one stage, all the Christian books destroyed, all the copies of the Bible that they could find, destroy them, get rid of them. This effort was obviously not totally successful. But soon after, Rome actually legalised Christianity, and by the year 400, the copies of the Bible had been compiled into one book, a Greek book known as the Septuagint. And it was then translated into Latin by a man called Jerome. Over 23 years it took him to do that. And that version was called the Vulgate. And that version is the version that the Catholic Church and other Christians, I guess, in Europe used throughout the period of the Dark Ages, which is the next 1,000 years. And we understand that period to be a time where public learning about the Bible and about God was very much discouraged and held pretty tight by the Catholic Church in that Latin format. But in the early 1300s, in the time of the Revolution, there's a renewed interest in theology, and because the Bible was only written in Latin, there was a big push to get it translated into English, and we owe that to a few different men. One of the big ones in the 1500s, obviously, William Tyndale. Eventually, he translated a complete copy of the Bible from very old manuscripts, surviving manuscripts, which were in fact from only about 1,000 years after 1,000 years. So the manuscripts that he translated the Bible from were already 1,000 years old from the time of the New Testament when it said it was written. And he was actually burned at the stake for doing that, so he paid a pretty high price for getting that Bible translated. And later on, the Bible was divided into chapters and verses, and in 1600s the King James Version was mass-produced. So, and from that time, scholars have continued to translate the Bible into different languages and versions to try and make it easier for people to read as well. And the reason I ran through that, and it's quite a colourful history, is we can see that the Bible has been passed down through ancient Jewish scholars. It's been protected from destruction from other civilizations, translated from Greek to Hebrew to Latin to English. It survived the Dark Ages. It was further translated and revised. And the point I came to when I was looking at all that history is, it seemed like it was pretty safe to say that there would be a reasonable degree of variance between the copy of the Bible that we have now and, say, a very early manuscript, a BC manuscript of, say, Isaiah, for instance. So if we had a 2,500-year-old copy of Isaiah, could we safely say, given all that happening through time, that our current version would be a fair bit different? Well, it's probably quite possible, I would have thought. But up until 70 years ago, and this adds to it, the world's oldest copies of biblical text that we could go off were only 1,000 years old. So already, it's nothing close to what you would call an original copy. Something that you'd call something from around the New Testament era would have to be 2,000 years old. So considering that, you'd surely think that it's a little bit jumbled up, a little bit uneven. I've probably used this photo before. Some of you would have seen this before. This is an infographic on Bible echoes, and it was compiled by a Christian pastor who throughout his life he'd noted down lots of cross-references in his Bible, and also a lot of the cross-references that are already in the King James Version. And he wanted to get a guy to put it into a graph for him to see how it was displayed. And they came up with this beautiful arc diagram. And so what can we tell or what should this graph be able to tell us about how we can engage with the Bible in the modern age, so far from its originality? Well, the cross-references in the Bible tell us that it is more so a beautifully rendered tapestry rather than a chaotic patchwork quilt. It's very evenly unified, and considering the fact that we've looked at all those different things that happen to the biblical text throughout time, in the face of such diversity, the Bible still holds unity, and the flow through the Bible is very consistent. The touch points for all the references that talks to each other are very symmetrical and balanced. And we believe as Bible students that God was obviously superintending the process to keep the Bible in its original state. And if the Bible's development had been completely random, like some critics would say, chaotic, with no purpose, in terms of going somewhere and actually meaning something real, I don't think after all that time that we would see an image like that. And ultimately for me, and for a lot of people here as well, when you study the book and see it come alive on so many levels of understanding, and you never see it fully exhausted, that is what really proves to me that the text itself and the prophecies in it are inspired by God. And eventually, I suppose, those sort of things overtake the historically visual facts that other people would go off to prove the Bible. So the fact that the chronological progression of the Bible matches that of our own history for the past 5,000 years, and it makes sense while doing it still, so much later, it should be enough proof to us that it was written when it was written. And historians will conclusively work backwards through time, and they'll say, yes, the Romans were around, yes, the Greeks, the Persians, the Babylonians, Egyptians. They get to the Sumerians, the Mesopotamians, and they start to lose real physical things that they can prove. But right back through then, they follow the same historical record as the Bible. And all the while through, as the Bible's matching that, it retains this unique connective message. So, despite even that, is there grounds, do you think, to say that the prophecies, like we read in Isaiah 53 there, that clearly reference Jesus or a Messiah, and there's many more prophecies you can look at, do you think, despite everything we've looked at, that a critic could say, well, how do you know that the Catholics or the Christians in the Dark Ages didn't add all these prophecies in to validate the Bible? How could we possibly prove that it is actually 2,500 years old? Well, one thing that proved that, and it was only in the last 70 years that these were found, is the Dead Sea Scrolls. So up until 70 years ago, the oldest physical manuscript of any biblical text was only 1,000 years old. But then these were discovered. They were discovered in 1947 in 11 caves along the northwest shore of the Dead Sea. And this is a very arid region, east of Jerusalem and 400 metres below sea level. And the Dead Sea Scrolls are comprised of the remains of approximately 900 separate scrolls preserved in jars, in clay jars. And they're represented by tens of thousands of other fragments as well. And the texts are most commonly made on leather, but also papyrus, and there's one in there that's made on a sheet of copper. But why are they important? Well, fragments of every single book of the Old Testament were discovered in the Dead Sea Scroll caves, except for the book of Esther. And identified among the scrolls are 19 copies of Isaiah, 25 copies of Deuteronomy, and 30 copies of the Psalms. And a virtually intact Isaiah scroll, which contains some of the most dramatic messianic prophecies like the one we read tonight in Isaiah 53. And these are all 1,000 years older than any previously found copy of the Bible in the world. And this library of scrolls appears to be hidden away in caves just before the outbreak of the Jewish revolt in AD 66. So just before the Roman army advances against the Jews and destroys everything they own. Some Jewish scholars run to these caves and they hide every copy that they've got. And based on various dating methods, the Dead Sea Scrolls would have to be written between the period of 200 or 300 BC to 70 AD. And many of the crucial Bible manuscripts that contain the prophecies about the Messiah, about Christ, date to at least 100 BC. So that's 100 years at a minimum before Christ actually came. And because of that fact, the Dead Sea Scrolls have revolutionised the textual criticism of the Old Testament. So we find these biblical texts in substantial agreement with the translations of the Old Testament that we have used today. And often they're very much word for word. So you can do a simple Google search on the Dead Sea Scroll of Isaiah 53. You'll see it there with the translation, and it's almost word for word exactly what we have in our Bibles today. So they've definitely provided phenomenal evidence for the credibility of Bible scripture, and specifically that Greater Isaiah scroll. It's almost identical to the most recent manuscript that we have that was 1,000 years older. So, remembering that the scrolls found in there were dated to as old as 300 years before Christ actually was on the earth. So they sit in this untouched environment for approximately 2,000 years. If they were hidden away in AD 70 and weren't found till 1947, that's nearly 2 millennia. They sat in these caves untouched, nobody destroyed them, no weather events got to them or fire or anything. And I think it's remarkable that in 1947, this Bedouin shepherd was throwing rocks into the cave just for fun, and he smashes a clay jar and subsequently stumbles upon these Dead Sea Scrolls. And 1 year later, after 2,000 years of history, of dispersion of the Jews returned to their homeland as a formal nation. So I don't take that as coincidence. I think in itself, just that fact that they were found at that time is remarkable. And so for me, it's encouraging to read these prior messianic prophecies with absolute assurance that they were written when they were written. And this means that 300 other Old Testament prophecies that we could go to of the coming Messiah did indeed pre-exist the birth of Christ. And so ultimately, I suppose it's up to each of us to decide what to do when we realise that as a reality. Now, the survival of the biblical text itself, in its accuracy, is amazing. But above this, it's also evident that the survival of the nation of Israel is also a major witness to the reality of Bible prophecy, which we'll come to in a sec. Thousands of years ago, Moses, Jeremiah, Ezekiel and Daniel and other Old Testament prophets, they foretold the destiny of the Jewish people. And as we see, external history confirms that everything happened just as it said it would in their order. And some of the prophetic information that we have recorded throughout the Bible is scarily accurate, if I can use that word. It's a very accurate record of history, the history of the world. And parts of Daniel, for instance, are extremely precise, down to very fine detail. And this is a very common depiction of Daniel 2, where Daniel explains the future empires to come, symbolised by Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And you could spend a whole night on this chapter itself. But basically, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. He can't decipher it, neither can any of his wise men. But Daniel's there, a Jew in exile from Jerusalem, and he goes through and explains it to Nebuchadnezzar. And he said, look, you're this head of gold, you're Babylon. But another kingdom inferior to you will arise. And so it did. Persia came and overtook Babylon. Daniel goes on to say that yet a third kingdom will come, a bronze kingdom, which is represented by Greece. And then there shall be a fourth kingdom that is strong as iron, represented by the Roman power that came. And the Romans if you look at their empire, was far larger than any of the previous ones, and they held a lot of strength with that. And then also the prophecy goes on to describe a divided kingdom, but some of the firmness shall be in it, which we take to be the Roman Catholic Church, which is really only the one surviving thing from the Roman Empire after it fell apart. The Roman Catholic Church is still around today. And towards the end of the prophecy, it describes a stone that was cut from a mountain by no human hand, which we put down to the Lord Jesus Christ. And this is a future fulfillment yet to happen, to come and to break in pieces all these kingdoms, and it hits it right on the feet at the one surviving thing of this image of man. So it's a very common depiction. It's widely confirmed to be accurate prophecy of the future that came after the time of Babylon. Not just Christadelphians say that, many Christians as well, and it's definitely pretty common. Another one is Daniel 11. I don't expect you to read that, but on purpose I've put it there because word for word in Daniel 11, through God's inspiration, Daniel describes in very fine detail the future history of the Greek Empire. And verse by verse you can go through and read the verse and read what happened in history. And it's pretty amazing to see, if you've never looked at it before, to go through and see how history played out as Daniel said it would in symbol. But basically, to give you a brief rundown of that one, Daniel gives you a brief prediction of the setting up of the Grecian monarchy upon the ruins of the Persian monarchy, which was now newly begun. A prediction of the affairs of the two kingdoms of Egypt and Syria, north and south, and they reference each other. Also, the rise of a powerful man, Antiochus Epiphanes, and his actions and successes. It talks about the Maccabean revolt, the emergence of a Roman power, and also a future, which we believe is yet to come, a future invasion of Israel in modern times. So verse by verse you can go through and follow the biblical prophecy as it symmetrically matches real events in sequence as recorded by other historians as well. And these events are often supported if you did history at school or university or something. They might not use the Bibles to substantiate it, but they'd use other things and they'd say exactly the same story that Daniel explains. So again, a very commonly reviewed prophecy, not just among Christadelphians, but the rest of the world as well. And you could spend a whole night on Daniel 2 and Daniel 11. But yeah, if you're interested, I can direct you to hour-long talks on each of them with much more information to prove that as well. So we've seen the history of the Bible itself. And despite everything that could have gone wrong, it has survived. And not only has it survived in its entirety as a whole book, but its accuracy has survived as well, and been proven to be the same for well over 2,000 years. We saw in that infographic that its symmetry and direction is consistent right the way through, and also the outside information on our recorded history matches the chronological sequence and the major prophecies of the Bible. And so for a book that's so small and so accessible today, in many different languages and translations, it's something that's certainly taken for granted by the majority. And this is very understandable, as man is always going to do what pleases him, and the Bible does place demands on us. And one theme I want to focus on to round out our thoughts tonight is the enduring survival and permanency of God's chosen people, the nation of Israel. Because the perseverance of Jewish existence proves that they are a living witness to Bible reality. And their history and future was written far in advance, and there's still prophecies to be fulfilled about them. So, when talking about God's chosen people, I suppose we can ask the question of why does God need a chosen people to outwork his plan and purpose? Why did God set apart a nation that was chosen? And from a Gentile or a non-Jewish perspective, when we think about the Jews as a chosen people, are they somehow superior to us or receive special treatment or are more loved by God than us. And the Jewish concept of a chosen people, as we see from the Bible, is not so much a badge of superiority and separation, as it is a humble call to action and responsibility, and to be an example to other nations. So very quickly then, what makes a Jew? Well, its origins begin with the word Hebrew, coming from the proper name Eber, listed in Genesis 10 as the great-grandson of Shem. And the original root word can be traced back to a phrase, from the other side. So in that case, Hebrew would be a word designating an immigrant, which Abraham, a descendant of Eber, certainly was. And Abraham's grandson Jacob's name was changed to Israel. In Genesis 35, we read that. So Jacob and his descendants would be called the first Israelites. And Jacob's fourth son, Judah, and his descendants were called Judahites or Judeans, and later the name Judean was shortened to Jew. So technically, Jews are Israelite Hebrews from the region of Judea, and they come from Abraham, who was a Hebrew, and then through Jacob, who was an Israelite, and through Judah, who was a Jew. So in common usage, all these names are words referring to God's chosen people, and ultimately the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And God's intention to identify with this particular nation of people was to the end that they might be an example to the rest of the world. So in Exodus 19, we read there that it says, "You shall be my treasured possession among all people." The King James says a peculiar nation. So this was the nation's initial calling to be separate from the rest of the world as they came out from bondage in Egypt. And if you turn to Deuteronomy chapter 28, just with me. Deuteronomy chapter 28. This chapter presents a reward to the Jewish nation should they faithfully obey. So Deuteronomy 28 verse 1 reads, "And it shall come to pass, if you will hearken diligently unto the voice of Yahweh thy God, to observe and do all his commandments which I command thee this day, that Yahweh thy God will set thee on high above all nations of the earth." So if they faithfully obey, they would be set on high and preserved. That was a reward to them. But if you look in verse 15, there's a warning there, and it says, "But it shall come to pass, if you will not hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to observe to do all his commandments and statutes, then all these curses shall come upon thee and overtake thee." And there's 54 preceding verses there that talk about all the curses that might come upon Israel should they disobey God's word, which we know obviously they did, and they actually did all come to pass upon Israel. So if you come over to verse 36, we read in verse 36, "Yahweh shall bring thee and thy king, which thou shalt set up over thee, unto a nation which neither thou nor thy fathers have known, and there thou shalt serve other gods, wood and stone, and shall become an astonishment, a proverb, and a byword among all nations, whither the Lord shall lead thee." So this is talking about the nation being exiled to Babylon, and there did come a king that took them away, and Israel did become an astonishment and a proverb, a byword to other nations around them. And if you come down to verse 48, we read there, it goes on to say, "Therefore shalt thou serve thine enemies, which Yahweh shall send against thee, in hunger and in thirst, in nakedness, and in want of all things, and he shall put a yoke of iron upon your neck, until he have destroyed thee. And Yahweh shall bring a nation against thee from far, from the end of the earth, as swift as an eagle flieth, a nation whose tongue you will not understand." Okay, so this yoke of iron represents the Roman takeover, and we have a link there to Daniel 2 in Daniel's image, where the legs of iron matched up with history and represented the Romans that did indeed come and take them. We can read of all the atrocities in AD 70 that happened to the Jewish nation. So these things have come to pass. This is confirmed as being have happened already. 2,000 years ago. So right throughout time, the Jews have been persecuted. And they are a tiny country. They're only 1/800th of the total Middle East as far as land mass goes, and they happen to be right in the middle, located on a plot of arid, resourceless land, and yet this seems to be one Jewish state too many for the rest of the world for much of time. Israel is condemned for daring to survive, and they're the only country in the world whose existence has been constantly challenged and is challenged today. So in Deuteronomy 28, we read a few verses in there, and we can see described that the Jews would be scattered all over the world, hated, persecuted, and driven from country to country. So we know we've got heaps of proof that they were exiled to Babylon. They came back to their land. Then the Romans came and destroyed them again. And that time they were dispersed for over 2 millennia. So that one, we can say, has been confirmed. We then can read a further prophecy in Leviticus that describes that meanwhile, while they're in exile, their land, once so fruitful, would lie desolate. And in more recent times, during the Jews' exile, after AD 70, a man called Mark Twain, you've probably heard of, he visited the land of Israel in 1869, and he wrote this brief description of the land. He says, "Of all the lands there are for dismal scenery, I think Palestine must be the prince. The hills are barren, they are dull of colour, they are unpicturesque in shape, the valleys are unsightly deserts, fringed with feeble vegetation that has an expression about it of being sorrowful and despondent." So there's nothing really there that took his fancy. It wasn't really a land flowing with milk and honey. And so we can see, like, just from Leviticus 28, saying that would happen, that even in our recent history, that will have been confirmed. In Jeremiah 30 and Hosea 3, we read that despite everything that happened to the Jews, they would survive all of these troubles and actually outlive their persecutors. So, like we've seen in our previous slides, Babylon persecuted them. Babylon's been and gone. Persia came and persecuted them. They've been and gone. The Greeks and even the mighty Roman Empire was, a lot bigger than the Israelites. They've all come and gone, and somehow the Jews, they've survived. And even after AD 70, when they lost their national land, they had no national territory. They were dispersed for 1,800 years throughout the world with actually no country of their own. And then despite that, they were still pursued. In World War II, we read of the Nazi annihilation, the annihilation attempt anyway. And while it was horrific, it actually paved the way for their return to Israel. And they are the only people on earth ever to retain their national identity without having a national territory. And I did take that from, I think something Morris once said. But yeah, I'll repeat that. So they're the only people on earth ever to retain their national identity without having a national territory. And for so long, it's quite remarkable that they actually got that back. And they even their original language has been preserved. So it's quite remarkable, and we can say that that's definitely been confirmed. Ezekiel 11 and 36, they also go on to say further prophecies, and these are just a few, there's many more, that eventually, while still disobeying God, the Jews would go back to their own land. And they definitely have. There's lots of history, very recent history to support that. Even in some of our lifetimes here, we would have seen that happen. And there's dates there and things that happened that progressed towards the state of Israel actually being declared. And again, I'll mention that I think it's very significant that those Dead Sea Scrolls were found 1 year before the Jews actually got their nation back. Amidst everything that was happening, all the persecution that they faced, I think that's definitely a remarkable thing that was found 1 year before they got their homeland back. And even after Israel got their land back, the Arab countries around them attacked them straight away. And so the Jews fought 3 more disastrous wars against the Arabs, and against overwhelming odds, and we can read this history as well, it's very much available online, definitely overwhelming odds, they were victorious every time. So yes, we can definitely say that all of that has been confirmed as well. So there's just a few things tonight, and there's lots more that we could go into, but to me they prove that history has indeed fulfilled Bible prophecy. The impossible became reality time and time again, and very unlikely events that seemed coincidence at the time, actually in hindsight we can see that they furthered the purpose for Israel over and over again. And the miraculous survival of the Jews and the Bible itself proves God's hand in history. And we hold history in hindsight now, don't we, with the Bible that we have and the history that we can look back on. And therefore I think we really do have an incentive to learn something from it. And if God has said things before that have happened, miraculous things, why won't the rest, all the future prophecies that the Bible contains, who's to say that they're not going to happen as well, and impossible as they may seem? So the Bible's it's not a boring book. It does come alive as the real truth is discovered. And the beautiful thing is that it's not just the Jews, God's chosen people, that get to rejoice at the end when Jesus returns to the earth. We can also share in God's reward to the faithful. So to truly believe this message tonight, that history proves Bible prophecy, it does take time, your own time and your own reading. And yes, God's word will put demands on all of us. And its message goes against our selfish nature and our desires. But there is a greater time to come, and it's promised to all who believe and live its message. And we can escape our otherwise wicked nature and mortality through God's grace and experience his character and creative power for eternity. So, in conclusion then, let's prepare for our future by learning from our history. Thank you.